The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and her footsteps echoed against the polished stone floor as she entered the church. Light spilled in from the high, stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned reflections that flickered across the pews. For a moment, she let herself breathe, hoping the familiar weight of incense and silence might soothe her. She had come seeking a quiet corner, a place to kneel, to think, to rest. But before she could reach the back row, a voice cut through the stillness like a blade. The priest at the altar had stopped mid-sermon, his eyes narrowing as they locked on her. His voice, already amplified by the cavernous acoustics, rose sharper than before. "You do not belong here," he declared, the words rolling across the congregation with a sting that left no room for confusion. Heads turned, the sound of rustling clothes and shifting bodies filling the air as dozens of eyes fell on her at once. She froze in the aisle, the weight of every gaze pressing down. Humiliation burned at the edges of her skin, a flush that crept into her cheeks. The priest did not stop. His words were laced with contempt, thinly veiled as authority. "This is a house of God. Respect must be shown. Some people do not understand that." Murmurs rose among the pews. A woman near the front lowered her head as if ashamed, while a man in the back crossed his arms in silent agreement. Children whispered to their mothers, tugging at sleeves, asking what was wrong. She stood still, clutching her bag tightly, her heart pounding but her posture unbroken. She thought of leaving. The door was only steps behind her. If she turned now, the tension would dissolve, the whispers would fade, and the priest would continue as though nothing had happened. But something in her refused. She had faced words like these before, in classrooms, in offices, in the quiet spaces where people thought prejudice could be disguised as principle. Each time she had let the sting settle inside her. This time, though, she planted her feet firmly on the stone floor and did not move. The silence stretched thicker now. The congregation seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see if she would bow to the humiliation. But her shoulders lifted slightly, her chin raised. She felt the fury inside her cooling into something stronger, not a burst of anger, but a steady fire. The priest faltered for just a moment, perhaps surprised she had not turned and walked away. His voice lowered, but the edge remained. "You were told before, this is not the place for you." Her chest rose as she inhaled deeply. She said nothing yet, but the stillness of her defiance filled the space. She was humiliated, yes, but not broken. And as the hush swept over the pews, it became clear to everyone watching that though she stood alone in the aisle, she was not the one who looked small. The silence of the church pressed against her, but her mind slipped backward, carrying her to the small moments that had built the foundation of her faith. She remembered the first time she had stepped through those doors as a child, holding her mother's hand. The building had seemed impossibly grand then, the ceiling soaring high above her head, the stained glass windows glowing like jewels in the sun. She had felt small but safe, wrapped in the warmth of voices rising together in song. As she grew, she had thrown herself into service. She lit candles before evening mass, careful to cup her hand against the flame so the wax wouldn't drip onto her dress. She swept the aisles when others had gone home, humming to herself as the light faded. When she was old enough, she joined the children's choir. Her voice had been high and clear, and sometimes parishioners would turn and smile when she sang, their eyes soft with approval. But approval never lasted. She noticed the difference early on. Other children were invited to sit closer to the altar, but she was always placed at the edge of the row. When roles were handed out for pageants, she was the shepherd or the servant, never the angel or the saint. Adults praised her voice, but when she asked questions about scripture, their smiles faltered. "Don't overthink," they told her, "just accept." By the time she was a teenager, the whispers had begun. Not loud enough to confront, but enough to bruise. Comments about her hair, her tone, the way she carried herself. Some parishioners said she was too proud, others that she was too different. She saw how their eyes softened for others but hardened when they rested on her. She swallowed the sting and tried to focus on the faith itself, telling herself that the people were flawed, but God was not. Still, her trust cracked. She began to see the politics behind the pulpit, the favoritism woven into every decision. Families with wealth sat at the front. Boys who misbehaved were given second chances, while girls who spoke too freely were called disruptive. She felt the divide widen with every year. Yet she stayed, sweeping floors, singing hymns, believing that service might someday bridge the gap. She could still remember the moment she began to see clearly. One evening after rehearsal, she overheard two of the older women whispering at the back of the church. One said she was too bold for her own good, that she would cause trouble someday. The other nodded, almost relieved, as if her fate was already sealed. She had slipped out quietly, heart pounding, realizing that no amount of service would ever erase the way they saw her. And yet, she kept coming, because faith lived deeper than their stares, rooted in something they could not touch. She carried that faith into her adulthood, even as the whispers followed her, even as the coldness grew. It was why she had walked into the church today despite the risk. She wasn't here for them. She was here for the God they claimed to serve, for the peace she still longed to find. Now, standing in the aisle as the priest's words struck like arrows, those memories returned in sharp detail. The child who once lit candles, the girl who once sang, the young woman who once swept the floors. All of them stood inside her still, and together they refused to bow. The silence pressed harder than the priest's words. She stood in the aisle, her body taut, every breath controlled, while the congregation shifted uneasily around her. People turned away when her eyes met theirs, staring down at hymn books or clutching rosaries with trembling fingers. A woman in the front row coughed softly, pretending to adjust her scarf. A man near the back crossed his arms and gave the faintest nod, his mouth twisted in agreement with the rebuke. It was easier for them to side with authority than to confront the unease curling inside their chests. The air thickened. The stained glass no longer glowed with the warmth of color. It seemed to cast long, distorted shadows across the pews, warping the figures who sat within them. Every whisper of fabric, every shuffle of feet echoed too loud, amplifying the choice they were making by saying nothing. She felt it, the weight of silence heavier than any word. For a moment, it seemed impossible to breathe. The walls of the church closed in, the vaulted ceilings no longer lifting her spirit but pressing down, suffocating in their grandeur. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her wrists, in the soles of her feet planted on the stone floor. Everything in her screamed to turn, to walk out, to leave behind the humiliation. But then the heat of anger began to change. It was no longer the burn of shame, but something steadier, sharper. She inhaled deeply, straightened her shoulders, and let the fire inside settle into clarity. They wanted her gone because they had always wanted her small, always wanted her voice quiet. Yet here she was, standing tall, refusing to flinch. The priest's words still lingered in the vaulted space, but she felt them lose their power. His voice had carried authority, but only because the congregation gave him that power by sitting silent. Now, as she stayed rooted in place, she realized the silence was no longer just his weapon, it was also his weakness. The longer no one spoke, the louder the truth became. She looked around, deliberately this time, forcing her gaze to meet theirs. Some shifted, uncomfortable under her calm stare. Others avoided her altogether. And yet she felt something crack in the room, a subtle shift, as though the very act of her not leaving was enough to plant doubt in those who had bowed their heads. Her heart steadied. The humiliation that had tried to bury her now stood like a stone under her feet, anchoring her. She would not collapse, she would not shrink, and though not a single person rose to stand with her, she knew they had all seen what she chose in that moment, to remain unbroken in the face of silence that was supposed to erase her. The priest's voice rose again, echoing off the stone walls, his words sharper now, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Leave this place. You do not belong here." His hand tightened around the edges of the pulpit, his jaw set, his authority pressed into every syllable. The congregation leaned forward, some nodding, others sinking deeper into their seats. She did not move. Instead, she drew a slow breath, lifted her chin, and raised her hand. The gesture was simple, yet it sliced through the moment with a weight that silenced even the whispers. Her finger extended, pointing straight at him, unwavering. Her voice carried, steady, measured, but it filled the cavernous space with a clarity that left no room for dismissal. "You tell me I do not belong," she said, the words threading into every corner of the cathedral. "But how many here know what you've hidden? How many here whisper behind closed doors about the things they are too afraid to speak aloud? A ripple moved through the pews. People shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between her and the priest. The priest stiffened, his face blanching under the weight of her accusation. She did not raise her tone. She didn't need to. The calmness of her words cut deeper than anger ever could. "You preach purity," she continued, her finger still fixed on him. "Yet you take offerings meant for the poor and spend them on yourself. You tell this flock to live in humility, but you dine with men who profit off their hunger. You tell them to confess their sins, while you hide your own." Gasps echoed softly, like the stirrings of wind before a storm. The congregation, bound by silence moments before, now shifted uneasily, the weight of recognition pressing into their hearts. They had seen glimpses, noticed things they dared not question: his sudden absences, the accounts that never added up, the way he silenced dissent with a glare or a sermon spun into condemnation. The priest opened his mouth, but no sound came. His lips parted, his throat tightened, yet her words had stolen his voice. His authority, once unquestioned, trembled in the silence that followed her. She lowered her hand, but did not waver. "You can tell me to leave," she said, softer now, though the softness carried more power than his earlier bark. "But you cannot make me small. Not anymore." The church fell into stunned silence, heavier than the silence before. This was not the silence of complicity, but of confrontation. It was the silence of people seeing their leader through a lens he had never wanted them to hold. Eyes turned away from him and toward her, measuring the courage it had taken to stand, to speak, to point where no one else dared. For the first time, the echo of her voice lingered longer than his. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in her, but in everyone listening. Murmurs rose like a tide, subtle at first, then swelling as people exchanged uneasy glances. The quiet dignity of the church was broken by whispers sliding across pews. Some tilted their heads toward one another, voices low but urgent. Others stared down at their clasped hands, remembering moments they had buried, inconsistencies they had chosen to overlook. Her words had not been wild accusations. They were threads, and every person in that cathedral could trace those threads back to something they had seen but refused to name. The priest shifted behind the pulpit, his collar stark against the flush creeping up his neck. He blustered, raising his voice in an attempt to drown out the rising hum of suspicion. "Lies," he said sharply, his words echoing too harshly in the vaulted space. Baseless slander meant to divide the faithful. His hands gripped the lectern as though the wood itself might anchor him, his fingers white with strain. But the strength in his tone faltered. For every denial he spoke, there was someone in the pews recalling a moment that contradicted him. A widow who remembered offering money for repairs that never happened. A young man who had seen him leave with men in suits late at night when the church was supposed to be empty. Parents who had once questioned why certain donations vanished into paperwork no one could explain. Their doubts, long hidden under loyalty and fear, now resurfaced with a clarity that stung. One woman, seated near the front, glanced at her neighbor and shook her head slowly. A man in the back coughed, the sound carrying more weight than the wordless agreement it represented. The murmur spread, rising until they filled the room with a sound no hymn could mask. The priest tried again to reclaim control, his words stumbling as he spoke of obedience, respect, tradition. But the conviction that once carried his sermons was gone. His voice trembled at the edges, the calm authority replaced with defensiveness. Each phrase he hurled felt less like leadership and more like desperation. She stood firm in the aisle, her eyes locked on him. She didn't need to add more. The silence between her words and his denials spoke louder than either of them. She watched as the congregation began to lean away from him, their shoulders stiffening, their faces drawn with unease. It was no longer only her standing against him. The weight of their unspoken memories, their suppressed suspicions, pressed down on him like a burden too heavy to bear. The collar around his neck, once a symbol of authority, now looked more like a chain. He tugged at it unconsciously, sweat forming along his brow, the power he wielded unraveling thread by thread. For the first time in years, perhaps in decades, the church did not feel like his kingdom. It felt like a place where truth had finally entered, sharp and undeniable. The murmurs did not quiet, they grew steadier, stronger, until the sound itself became a verdict, and in that sound his authority cracked. The murmurs grew into something heavier, pressing against the vaulted ceiling until they could no longer be ignored. She stood in the aisle, still and steady, while the priest fumbled behind the pulpit. His words tumbled out in fragments, defenses and accusations that carried less weight with every repetition. The congregation, once so quick to bow to his authority, now shifted in another direction. It started with a single motion. A woman in the front pew rose slowly, her hands trembling as she placed them on the bench before her. She looked at the priest, then at the woman in the aisle, and nodded once. It was small, almost timid, but it carried like a spark through the stillness. Across the room, a man lowered his head into his hands, shame etched across his face. He had ignored too much for too long. His silence was an admission. Others followed. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "She's right." The mother's eyes flicked up, meeting the gaze of the woman in the aisle, and for the first time her lips pressed into something like agreement. A young man at the back leaned forward, no longer hiding his discomfort. The energy shifted palpably, like the turning of a tide. She felt it in her bones. The power in the room was no longer fixed at the pulpit. It had begun to flow toward her, not because she demanded it, but because truth has a gravity of its own. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't pleaded. She had simply stood, pointed, spoken, what others were too afraid to voice. And now the weight of that truth settled into the hearts of the congregation. Undeniable, undeniable in its clarity. The priest's voice wavered. Higher now, strained. He demanded obedience, claimed betrayal, tried to paint her as the enemy of order. But the more he spoke, the less conviction rang in his tone. The collar that had once symbolized reverence now seemed a costume, his words the last gasps of a man watching his authority slip away. She did not smile. She did not gloat. Her posture remained steady, her eyes focused, her silence now louder than any sermon he could deliver. For the first time, the congregation was not looking at him. They were looking at her. The moment stretched, heavy and fragile. Then, almost like a breaking dam, the silence released into a collective breath. Some nodded quietly. Others clasped their hands tighter, unwilling yet to admit their agreement out loud, but no longer willing to deny it to themselves. The shift was complete. What once felt like his kingdom had cracked open. Authority no longer lived at the pulpit. It had taken root in the aisle, in the courage of the one who refused to leave. And though she stood alone in body, she was no longer alone in spirit. The church itself seemed to bow to the truth that had been spoken, its silence not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement. The priest's voice thinned until it was barely more than a rasp. He tried one last time to gather his authority, but the words fell flat, landing weakly in a space that no longer belonged to him. His hands, once gripping the pulpit with command, slipped away. Shoulders heavy, he stepped back, retreating toward the shadow of the altar. It was not an admission in words, but the act itself revealed everything. She did not move immediately. She let the silence hold, let the weight of his retreat sink into the air. When she finally stepped forward, her pace was calm, her steps echoing lightly against the stone. She did not march, did not stride with anger or triumph. She simply walked with presence, steady and unyielding, toward the space he had abandoned. Gasps fluttered softly through the pews as she approached the altar. The congregation leaned forward, uncertain of what would come next. She did not climb the steps to the pulpit. She did not touch the microphone or place her hands where his had rested. Instead, she stood just before it, her figure framed by the light pouring through the stained glass windows, the silence thick and complete. She looked out over the faces, each one searching hers, and allowed the quiet to linger until it became something more than absence of sound. It became a statement. It became proof. The silence told them what words could not. That power had shifted. That faith did not rest in the collar of one man, but in the courage to name what had been buried. No sermon was needed. No fiery speech or declaration. The truth had already been spoken, and the absence of denial was louder than any further argument. The people in the pews felt it settle inside them the knowledge that their faith was never meant to be tethered to one voice, one man, one fragile claim to authority. She did not gloat. She did not look toward the priest cowering in the shadows. Her eyes remained on the congregation, soft but unwavering. Her presence was not a performance, but a reminder, a living testament to resilience. In that moment, she embodied something the church had forgotten: that strength does not always shout. It sometimes stands in stillness until all else falls silent. When she finally lowered her hand from where it had once pointed, she folded it calmly at her side and turned away. The silence remained deep and profound, as though the very stones of the building were holding their breath. She left the altar not as someone who had claimed it, but as someone who had revealed its truth. And as she walked back down the aisle, the congregation did not look at the priest. Their eyes followed her, the new voice of courage, the one who had faced what was hidden and refused to bow. In that silence, faith shifted. It was no longer his. It was theirs. It was hers.